Welcome to Women's Wisdom, a series on sensuality, sexuality, love, power, and other issues that support the honoring and empowerment of women's experience in the world now and into the future. The inspiration for this series and the topics themselves were raised by you, the women we've met while touring the country, leading women's circles and conversations. There were so many overlaps in the concerns and narratives women shared that we wanted to bring dialogue out into the open. Rosebud Woman is a family-owned company that is all about reverent, intimate wellness for all stages of a woman's life. We are dedicated to bringing more joy and reducing suffering in minds, hearts, bodies, and culture around the female experience. Consider this series as our gift to you. Welcome back to Rosebud Woman's Women's Wisdom Show. I'm Lisa Betts-Lacroix, and I'm your host for today's show and for every show. This is the fifth in our series of 9. And if you've missed any of our previous episodes, be sure to visit the Rosebud Woman YouTube page and learn from the wisdom of our past guests. Today's show is Spacious, Sensuality in a Mad World, how to feel more joy in everyday life. And our guest today is Dr. Kat Meyer. We'll be talking about being in the body and how to feel pleasure and safety and openness there in these crazy times, in this world with its pressure to seek external approval. And then given our past and our personal traumas, how difficult it is sometimes to be in relationship with ourselves, with our bodies, with our sex, and with our partners. Sometimes it can be difficult. So before we welcome our guest, Dr. Kat Meyer, I want to remind you that we welcome your input. We really want to have engagement here. So please do share your questions and your comments. You can drop your comments into the chat box. And if you have questions for Dr. Kat Meyer, then you can drop them into the Q&A link at the bottom of the screen. So, what I would want you to know about our guest today is Dr. Kat Meyer is a sex therapist. She's a yoga instructor and a Reiki practitioner dedicated to evolving the relationship we have surrounding sexuality in our bodies. She's the founder of sexloveyoga.com, which is an online platform integrating various schools of thought, including science, tantra, body movement, and psychology. And she's the host of the podcast, Eat.Play.Sex. So we're going to welcome Dr. Kat to the show. And Dr. Kat, would you please join us and welcome to Rosebud Woman's Wisdom.
Hello. Thank you for that. And it's with the lights coming down, it's like you are illuminating our minds. You're just bringing us to light out of the darkness. So thank you on behalf of all women.
I love that. That's beautiful. Love the reframe.
I got you. I support you.
All right, we're together here. So I would love to invite you, if you would, to start off by giving us a sense of how our past, how our histories, how possibly the trauma that I referenced earlier can sometimes impact us, and like what you might share with us about the damaging messages that can be traumatic, specifically around beauty, and how that's impacted you, perhaps, and how you see it impacting your clients and the people you work with.
Yeah, so trauma in and of itself is such a complex experience because a lot of times when we think of trauma, we think of somebody, sexual assault, or we think of the war and somebody having PTSD. But trauma can be, and those are traumas, those were what we refer to them as big T traumas. But then there's also these smaller T traumas that we can experience on a daily basis. So these are the things like somebody says something to us and it causes our body to contract, or it causes us to, startle or distress in response to whatever that was. Now, what's interesting, when the brain experiences, the brain and the body experience trauma, it's it's almost like the brain short circuits around it. So normally our brain is naturally processing, like everything that I'm saying, everything that's in our room is just moving fluidly through the brain, no problem. But when we hit a distressing point like that, the brain is like, ugh! And so all the pieces that make up an experience, you know, the thoughts, the feelings, the body reactions, the belief about ourselves in that situation get input into the brain in pieces. So what we'll see is that we oftentimes carry the understanding of this, or the belief about ourselves from this experience, into other experiences moving forward. So say somebody told me that, you know, my ponytails look stupid or something like that, you know, when I was 5. And then I can internalize myself of, oh, I'm not cute, or I'm not enough, or love is conditional. You know, so I have to show up in a certain way in order to be received by this group of friends or by my parents. And then moving forward, now I see through a lens of that belief, and I'm making sense of my world and of my actions through that belief. And yeah, are you going to say something? Illuminate us.
I just wanted to draw attention to the fact, something you just mentioned, I think is so important and isn't always recognized in our culture, is the impact of micro experiences.
Yeah.
And I think there's a tendency in our world to think, well, I didn't have a huge trauma. I think you're bringing really, really beautiful awareness to that fact, is that we don't necessarily have to have been majorly traumatized to experience trauma. And just those micro experiences, like a comment someone makes, can actually land in our nervous systems and our psyche. So I really appreciate that, because I think that's not always recognized in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
you know, I want to ask you more about that nervous system piece and about attachment theory, because I know you know a lot about that, and I think it's so critical to understanding who we are in the world. But before we do, I didn't really give you a chance to talk about how you came to do the work you're doing. And I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about that through a lens and as a segue to your experience and your interest in attachment theory.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everything that I've experienced in my life, I can see now is a compilation of, you know, helps me to better understand and empathize and drive me forth into doing this type of work. I come from a childhood sexual trauma, related trauma, and eating disorders for 11 years, depression, suicide ideation from like my young years into my teens and college. And then coming into yoga, I started teaching yoga when I was 20. And that was the first time that I was in my body, that I could feel safe and calm, and everything was just chill in my body. And I was like, oh, this feels good. Who knew that this could happen? And then moving forward from there, just diving into studying sexual, sex education, going to school, getting my doctorate in marriage and family therapy, and specializing in sex, and then diving into more embodiment practices and somatic practices. And even in my early 20s, I, again, experienced sexual assault. And so it was such an interesting experience of realizing, I'm learning all these things on the intellectual level, and I could tell you everything about, what the penis does and what the vulva does and all that stuff, but I wasn't actually embodying it. I was even a yoga instructor, and I still wasn't embodying it. Embodiment would last me maybe like 30 minutes after a class, an hour, maybe a little more, but then I would be right back to my super anxious, like disconnect from my body, disassociating and just not being there. So all of these pieces have, comprise how I see healing, and I see it from a multi-level experience. Like, we could address the mental aspect, but if we don't address the body aspect of it and get the body to regulate itself, then it's not going to do a whole lot. We're just going to keep finding ourselves falling into the same patterns again and again and again.
Right. So let's start with the mind, because it's a part of it. And I know you're multidimensional, and you come from the psychological awareness piece, and you have the intellectual piece. And so maybe you can describe and give us a little bit of a primer on attachment theory, and how that is information that we can learn about ourselves that can actually possibly, I'm assuming, inform how we deal with the physical aspects of our embodiment and joy and pleasure.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing, is that they're one and of the same. They're not separate. Even when we talk about real attachment theory, and not any of this bullshit pop psychology that's out there that just says, oh, you're this or this, you're this, almost like a personality test. It's actually really in depth and really complex. There's, we talk about these four main ones. Actually, most of the time we talk about three. That's secure. We talk about anxious, insecure, or also called preoccupied, or avoidant, insecure, which is also called dismissive. And then we also talk about disorganized, which is also fearful, avoidant. Now, there are 19 different subcategories of that. So as much as we would love to be able to, take a BuzzFeed quiz and say, hey, I'm this one, it's not so easy. But what we can do is start identifying what some of our patterns are, and to be able to catch ourselves in the moment and teach ourselves the skills to be able to be in relationships in a more, interact in relationships from a more secure stance, instead of just allowing ourselves to fly off the handle, or default to what is in our design. Right now, when we look at attachment theory, this starts when we're young. We look at the very first relationships that were formed with us and our primary caregivers. Most of the time, this is our parents, but sometimes it's not. And that also can play a role in our the design of our nervous system. So from our formative years, between 0 to 18 months, we are this sponge, and we're taking in everything about our environment to develop a system in our bodies that would optimize our survival. So if we are able to get our needs met from our primary caregiver, then we're going to establish more of the world is safe, I am good. If we get our needs met, inconsistency, so sometimes we get them met and sometimes we don't, then we will design a nervous system that will probably be a lot more sensitive to reacting in order to get the needs met. And this is where we see people who might get really anxious if there is a perceived threat that their needs aren't going to be met, or that love isn't going to be received, and would have a harder time being able to regulate the nervous system or bring it down themselves. A lot of times they have to have another person to be able to help them co-regulate, meaning they allow the other person to regulate them. So a lot of times we'll see people as adults, if they haven't been able to develop skills to regulate their nervous system themselves, then a lot of times they'll find themselves going in one relationship after another relationship after another relationship, or just have a really hard time being with themselves and by themselves. Now, we don't want to shame or blame anybody for having this design in their nervous system. We just want to empower people to learn how to be able to regulate themselves and learn how to use the skills that are going to be able to help them be in healthy relationships. Then we also have somebody who might develop more of a dismissive or an avoidant type of attachment strategy. And that would look like their needs tend to consistently not be met. And that means, they might cry or throw a tantrum or that kind of thing. And for whatever reason, their primary caregiver just can't be there. Maybe their parents work a lot. Maybe their parents struggle with depression, or just this inability to be there. Or maybe the parents can't have trouble with attuning to their baby, which means being able to read the cues of their child to be able to accurately assess what the child needs. Because a parent could keep showing up and be like, oh, take this and this and this. And the baby's like, I don't need any of that stuff. So their nervous system would design more of a slow rise to activation. So it takes them a lot longer to get activated. A lot of times they'll be disconnected from those experiences. And so that's why somebody who might have more dismissive or avoidant type of strategies, we're like, why aren't they paying attention to me? Or why don't they want intimacy? Or why can't they show up for me, or whatever it is? And a lot of times they're just not connected to their own internal process, and have less ability to be able to attune to the needs of other people, which we need to be able to read people's faces and nonverbals to be able to see what it is that they actually want, or what's real, or, that kind of thing. And then the last one is more of a disorganized attachment. And that is somebody who's experienced trauma at an early age, and they weren't able to, they didn't have any sort of resources to be able to help them navigate through that. So a child can experience trauma at an early age, but if the family shows up and really is there for the child to be able to help them regulate themselves again, then they can, move on and grow and develop into, more of a secure attachment, and that's fine. So this is more of a child who doesn't have those resources. Sometimes we see a parent who has mental health struggles or lack of resources themselves to be able to access, to be able to care for the child. So then we see them, developing as adults. If they haven't had the care or worked with a therapist to be able to help them, gain those skills, we'll see them really having a hard time entering into relationships and staying in them. So they can have any of the strategies. It's not organized. That's why we say it's disorganized, because they can be avoidant, they can get anxious, they can be, all these things. But ultimately we see oftentimes they're fearful to enter into a relationship, and then or they're avoidant to enter into relationships, and then they're fearful once they get into this because they're afraid that the person will leave them.
Interesting. I can really see how an awareness of a person's orientation in terms of attachment theory would help you as a therapist teach them self-regulation, and also, what did you call it? There's the light. Teach them personal regulation skills, but also the ability to, what did you call it? The co-regulation or
co-regulation.
co-regulation
Yes.
in relationship. And what I'm extrapolating from that is that if we know our system and how our system is wired, then we can start to build strategies and tools for dropping into our body, becoming more embodied for our own pleasure and for our connection with our partners.
Ultimately, I encourage embodiment for everyone,
right?
Because whether you're somebody who struggles with anxiety and it's hard to be able to, be in your body, or letting, or if you struggle with attuning to another person and be able to read their skills, or even know what your internal experience is.
Right.
So some people even take up the energy or the mood of another person. And this is where a lot of people identify as empaths. They're like, oh, I'm empathic, I feel everything and everyone. Well, part of that is also because you have trouble with separating yourself from another person. And that's a skill that we can learn. So we can learn because it is in their best interest to be able to tune into the reactions and the anxiety of another person. Because if they can regulate that other person, then this person can regulate and calm down, which is really interesting. Yeah. And we kind of look to the other people for, how are we supposed to interact in this threat-filled world?
Right. So you're really big on pleasure. And I know it's an area that you have a lot of expertise and a lot to share. I want to ask you about it. But before I do, I want to remind our attendees, we really want to know, what do you want to know from Dr. Kat about pleasure, about attachment theory, about relationships, or about anything related to her areas of expertise? Please share questions. We want to address the queries that you have and the reason that you're here. So please do share. Now, as far as pleasure goes, Dr. Kat, you have an entire, well, first of all, let me ask you, but in the vast scheme of our world and all that's happening, can you just share a little bit about why pleasure is so important?
Huh.
We go on for days about this,
honey. Yeah, besides the obvious fact that it just feels good.
I've heard you say something that has a deeper piece, that it actually is a contribution to the world. Like maybe it's how we relate to each other, how we show up in the world.
Yeah, totally. I see that our culture is a punishment ethos, meaning that we base a lot of our decisions on how to avoid pain or how to avoid discomfort. Like we go to the gym, not just because we enjoy going to the gym, although I like it, but we go to it to avoid gaining weight. Or we eat this specific food because we want to avoid gaining weight. Or even we make our partners feel bad or guilty or jealous in order to gain their love or gain their attention, kind of thing. But if instead we started asking ourselves, well, what would feel good for me? Like, what feels good for me? Then we start creating a life that isn't based on like this tension in our bodies from trying to avoid, but a relaxation and to be able to too open to enjoyment. What we also know is that tension causes us to be able to receive less pleasure in our body. So when our bodies tense and contract, our sensory receptors close. So we're less open to receiving pleasure. But when we're relaxed and we're open, we can feel so much more. That's why taking, yoga classes or breathing exercises or meditation or mindfulness in the body and helping ourselves to just kind of drop in and relax helps us to feel so good, even sexually. If we if we notice when our body starts contracting or our breath starts getting a lot more shallow, if instead we choose to relax and we take deeper, longer breaths and we relax our pelvic floor, we can have so much greater pleasure potential and orgasmic potential. We don't even realize that we're already capping it.
Interesting. So it's a little bit of a rewind, but I'm betting you can incorporate the idea of pleasure. I want to ask you about pleasure practices, because you have an entire video on pleasure practices. So I'm wondering if you might be able to integrate that with a question from one of our attendees who asks about resources for long-term relationships in terms of exploring the attachment piece deeper. In the context of long-term relationships. So those things may be related or maybe not. Either address them like one-on-one, like one at a time, or integrate them in whatever way makes sense.
Yeah. So I might want to take both of them a little bit separately. So pleasure practices, anything that we can, what I do in the morning is I always start with some sort of practice to get in my body, because once I sit down at my laptop, I'm like here, I'm cognitive and I'm like, blah, blah, blah. But if I start out with some sort of like mindfulness practice, meditation practice, I do self-pleasure practices. So I actually use Rosebud's arousal with my little yoni egg or one of my crystal wands, just to connect more sensually with myself. I also am playing music when I'm getting ready. So I'm always like dancing and just being in that space of like openness. I also do breast massage every morning or in the middle of the day. And that not only helps to flush out the lymph systems of all the toxins that might have been built up in the body, but also reconnects me with my body and also increases the sensitivity of my breasts. Now, so many of us have these negative messages around our breasts, and a lot of us grew up with, whether they're too tiny or they're too big, or we developed faster than the rest of our other classmates. And so having that moment to just be with the body, lotioning up your body after a shower, just ultimately creating space for yourself to be with yourself helps us to be able to do that. We can do this with partners by, maybe we want to practice breath work together, eye gazing, sensual touch. Maybe we create a little love lab and try out different types of touch on each other, different types of words on each other, see what type of words really land and which types of words definitely don't land. And also making decisions on a daily basis of what would feel good for me, what would be pleasurable for me. Maybe going to a farmer's market and getting some flowers for myself, not because for any sort of end goal. And that's a key point here, not to do these things for an end goal or purpose, but simply because it feels good.
So important. I love that. And I love the fact that even though you haven't addressed how the attachment information plays into or could inform a long-term relationship, some of the pleasure practices you just described could absolutely support reconnection in a long-term relationship, because sometimes in long-term relationships we forget about just those simple things about touch and the kind of practices that you're suggesting.
And that's the thing, is because with attachment theory, a lot of times we have this internal fear. If we have more insecure strategies that we default to, then there's this internal message of either they're going to leave me, which means that my needs aren't going to be met, or there's an underlying shame about ourselves. Something's wrong with me. So why would this person want to be with me? Therefore, I will shorten depth of intimacy, or I will, do some sort of sabotage to make sure that that person never actually sees who I am at my core, which is interesting. So with our partner, we want to become an expert of our partner's vulnerabilities and of the things that soothe them. So if we can write out a list of, what are some of the topics that my partner has become activated on. I love using the word activated instead of the word triggered, because triggered has more of a negative connotation to it, but activated. Their nervous system gets activated. We get flooded with emotion. What have been some of those things? Or what have been some of the past experiences of my partner from when they were younger that have an impact on them? So maybe they've experienced trauma, or maybe they experienced struggle with their parents. What are those? And then have your partner be able to do the same. And then create another list on what are the things that I've seen work with my partner that soothes them. So maybe it's their love language. Maybe it's a touch. Maybe it's a nonverbal look. Maybe, it's some words that you specifically say. And your partner can come up with the same, both for themselves and for their other partner. And then have a dialogue around this and see how this matches with one another. Then we also want to, when we're having conflict or when we're having dialogue with our partner and they get activated, we need to remember, they're not present anymore, because now they're engaging more of the part of the brain that is in survival, and they're no longer connected with the higher functioning part of the brain. So they probably won't be able to logically see us and where we're coming from, and us them as well. So when we hit these, we're hitting the wall against our partner and nobody's really seeing each other. It's exactly that. Nobody's seeing each other. And you can try to explain yourselves as much as you want to, but ultimately we're back here in the more primal part of the brain. So take a break, but make sure you give a specific time to be able to come back to this. That way the partner doesn't perceive that you're abandoning them, but they know this is important to you as well, and that you're giving a different time to be able to come back. Then a lot of times things can clear in our minds, and we're back to access to the frontal lobe of the brain.
Wow, I really appreciate the choice of words, the word choices that you've made specifically around activation versus triggering. And it seems to me that ties into the idea of shame that you mentioned earlier. Like there's something about triggering, well, you're triggered, that has a little bit of a blame, negativity, kind of shaming piece to it. Whereas activation really suggests that you're alive and you're human and you've got a reaction to something, which seems just a lot more inclusive and expansive, and creates more space for curiosity and connection. And I just want to play back just to underline and also to refresh my memory, the practice that you just described, which sounds really powerful, which you said to know your partners, the things that are the things that activate your partner. And the other piece was what? Can you just refresh my memory, because I'm trying to integrate it all.
Become an expert of your partner's vulnerabilities and what soothes them.
Oh, great. So your partner's vulnerabilities and what soothes them, and obviously your own same, right? And you need to know your own, the examples of what soothes you and what's vulnerable to you too.
Yeah. What both self-soothes you, so what self-regulates you. And for me, those are things like breathing. I do breath work. I go to yoga. I go running. I paint. And then what also soothes my partner. So a touch, a hug, a cuddle, specific words, saying things like, I got you, I'm here with you. Or even sometimes it's just a reassuring look.
Wow.
And that's going to be different for everybody. Because again, we need to remember, if our partner struggles with attuning or being able to pick up these nonverbal, then that might not be something that will be helpful, but maybe a touch would be, or words would be.
It's really just striking me how different our world could be if we all had such intentional conversations with each other, such self-awareness, such other awareness, and we actually sat down and share these specific things, because I don't think that happens very often. And I think what you've referred to earlier is when we get disconnected from each other, and we might not even know why it is, because we can have been married to someone for 10, 15, 20 years and never have had the conversation that is, when you say this, I feel this, or when you say this, I feel this. And gosh, it is just striking me what a different world it could be if we were that intentional about our reactions in both a positive and activated way.
And yet so many, and the problem is that a lot of us aren't connected to it, whether we don't give the quiet time or the reflection time to be able to go in and figure out what it is, how it is that we're actually showing up, or even connected with the internal stories and dialogue that we're telling ourselves in our own head, and I think that's also a powerful tool to be able to share with our partner. You know what, right now, the story that I'm telling myself in my head is that you don't actually want to be with me, that you're with me out of pity. And then the partner has the opportunity to be able to clarify what might be going on there, and validate ourselves. It makes sense that my head goes to these specific stories for a reason, given everything that I've experienced in my life. I'm not crazy. It just is misattributed here. It's not, it doesn't fit the reality, the ultimate reality that's in front of me. It's more in this conceptual reality in my head. And I can be so vulnerable and own this and wear my heart on my sleeve and create opportunity for intimacy with my partner, with friends, with anyone, and while still not blaming or victimizing myself, because there's no victimizing by saying, you know what, the story I'm telling myself in my head is this, and I'm recognizing it's a story, and there may be some truth to it, and there may not be. I may be projecting, but this is how I'm feeling right now.
Right. Taking responsibility for the feelings and how those lead to thoughts and the stories that we make up about what we're experiencing is so powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this is such rich, deep stuff. And I love the possibilities that it provides for creating more connection, like you say, in all kinds of relationships, starting with the self and then every other kind of relationship. Can we talk a little bit about, I know you also have a lot of information and knowledge about the physical contributions, and you shared some of the practices, like the pleasure practices that
Mm-hmm.
but I know you also have a fair amount of information about nutrition and about hormones. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about your knowledge, just like kind of a teeny little insight. I know you can't share all that you know, but just a little bit of, some little tidbits about what we might be thinking about in terms of how we approach our lives in terms of nutrition, hormones, and the other physical things that we have control over.
Yeah. I actually dive into this deeper on my podcast, Eat.Play.Sex podcast, everything about nutrition, sex, and relationships, as well as my online program, Love.Body. So going into, these exact nutritional pieces and our gut microbiome and our vulva biome and our thyroid and, our adrenal system, because all of these play a role in our hormone production. So what we're seeing right now is there are, so many things. Our bodies are consuming so many toxins from our environment. So a lot of heavy metals are even in our beauty products that we're putting on our face or that we're dyeing our hair with, and it's leaking into our system, causing disruption in the hormone production. Now we also our lifestyles are this super productive, go, goal oriented. How much can I accomplish in a single day? And with that, we're drinking a lot of coffee, a lot of caffeine, trying to keep up, and it's exhausting our adrenal systems. And our adrenal systems are so crucial for our hormone production. And so now a lot of women are coming to me and saying that they have low sex drive, or that they, don't want sex, or they're just feeling foggy brained or fatigued and all this stuff. And a big part of it is looking at the lifestyles and the things that they're consuming. If they've already worn out these internal systems of their body, then how can we expect our bodies to be able to work optimally? We can't. The body's actually speaking to us and saying, I need help, come to me and help me out, and we're not listening to it because we're just so focused on these other things that we need to achieve, instead of pausing, coming back to the body and taking care of that.
So are you saying that coffee and sex drive are negatively correlated?
No, I am saying that things that there's nothing wrong with coffee.
Right. I mean, and I'm joking. I mean, but I get that the general idea is that you're trying to bring more awareness to how we treat our adrenal systems in general as a whole piece.
Right, right. If we're just continuing to zap our body and saying, go, 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 and our body's like, no, I can't, I've already exceeded my limit, and we're still telling it to go, 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 then we wonder why we're sick all the time, or why we're tired, or why we're having bad sex, or why we're not having sex at all, because the body needs help. It needs our help to be able to optimally function. And a lot of times people don't even realize how their gut microbiome plays a big role in all of this too. Speaking for myself, I am a I am a recovering type A personality and perfectionist, and I was one of those people that was constantly driving to do more and be more. And God, I would like get up at 6 a.m., do my workout, go to school, go to grad school and drink coffee, a lot of coffee in between, teach yoga, then work on my dissertation all in one day, which was, and then I was just so exhausted and I didn't want sex and I just didn't want I was just kind of meh. And I had worked with a functional nutritionist who was my co-host on the podcast. And she, came up with all these levels, and I had a leaky gut syndrome. So I was having stomach aches all the time with everything that I was eating. I was producing, the cortisol levels in my body were so high that it was just so much inflammation in my body, and nothing was, everything was just fatigued, adrenals fatigue. So I had to go through a whole protocol to cleanse everything out. I cut coffee from my diet. I still drink matcha tea every day, so I definitely have my caffeine, but it's not that same jolting experience that I used to have. And I feel a lot sexier in my body even because I don't have all that inflammation and the pain in my body. And, I didn't want people to touch me because it physically did not feel good. I felt like I was crawling out of my skin all the time. And part of that was anxiety because I, just felt, in a sense, there was this underlying belief in myself that I wasn't enough if I couldn't produce more, production equaled value of myself. So there's the mental emotional piece of it, along with the physical aspects and the motivation for that type of lifestyle that was essentially killing me.
Yeah, I really hear that you can't separate them, because if you have that orientation in the world or the belief system that you have to produce or do more, then you're probably going to be making choices that are going to be stressing your adrenal system and all of that. What I'm gathering is the truth of how all of that, all those choices, that thinking and the follow-on actions remove us from our body or kind of disconnect us, and how it makes it harder for us to drop in if we're always activated.
Right.
So,
We don't want to be in our body when we're so activated, when we're so uncomfortable. And that's why I had to, I knowingly developed this disassociation where I would just check out. I would, not be in my body. And part of that is from the past trauma as well. But part of that was also because it was just so uncomfortable to be in here. I didn't want to be in there.
Totally true. Well, thank you so much for all of this amazing wisdom. I'm wondering if, in the context of the conversation and the things we've talked about, if you feel like there's anything that women who want to be more embodied, experience more pleasure, have better relationships and better sex might need to know about that I haven't asked you about. Is there anything that you've recently been thinking about, or a topic that's currently on your mind, or anything that we might have missed?
Yes, actually. And this follows up with, so I do these monthly women's sensual yoga classes called Undone Yoga. And we do the yoga in our underwear as a way to undo these negative messages around what it means to be a sensual woman and to be in our bodies with a room full of other women doing the same. And what I'm getting to here is there are all these negative messages around being sensual. Sometimes we would see a woman and she's in her bodies and she's feeling herself, or she's taking a selfie or something, and we judge that and we say, oh, like she's full of herself, or she's just trying to get attention and blah, 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 blah. Instead of, just honoring her and be like, yes to that. Like, you're in your pleasure. You're saying yes to being in your body. You love your body. You're celebrating it. I want more of that. Instead, we just shame.
Yeah.
So,
okay. So since you mentioned that, and since you brought it up, I gotta raise the current issue in the culture and the larger culture that's really bringing that up right now, the whole Super Bowl halftime thing. And I've seen that blowing up on my social media in terms of both shame and also a stance for, this is an opportunity to see ourselves as sensual, sexual, embodied beings, even after age 50. And, it's a complicated, and my own personal feeling about it is it raises the complexity of when we change the cultural narrative, it's kind of messy. And they're all these internalized things we have to, grapple with. And so there is this part of the story and part of the thinking that I'm seeing coming up where people say that's the old way, that's playing into, representation of women in a past way that's objectified. And so we don't want that. It's not actually moving forward. And then other people who are saying, hey, I'm liking the fact that we can be wide ranging in our experience of ourselves and in our representation of ourselves. So you want to tell me where you're sitting on that? Because with the context that where I'm sitting in it is mostly along the line of let's have freedom. Let's get rid of comparison culture. Let's get rid of all shame. Let's allow people to be embodied and enlivened and sensual and sexual in whatever way they choose. Mm-hmm. That's my context. But what do you have to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And let's remember that some people feel really empowered and sexy in more clothes, and some people feel more empowered and sexy with less clothes. And who are we to project onto somebody else how they need to define that or delineate that for themselves? And if somebody feels, that is their most authentic expression, then let them, celebrate them. They're owning themselves. They are being walking permission slips for us to step up into whatever that is for us. I don't believe or ascribe to any of this thought of, oh, she needs to dress her age. Like, no, she needs to dress the way that she wants to, the way her body feels good and most comfortable and most alive, versus us telling them that their body is not the right shape for whatever they're wearing or this, that, or the other.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on one of the most important things in that topic, in that conversation, but also in how we experience ourselves in our relationships. And that is that we're the masters of our own experience. And the more we can recognize that everyone else is the master of their experience. And I think you mentioned the idea of not sovereignty. In one of the videos I saw, you mentioned the 3 points, and one of them was there was consent, 3 things. Do you know what I'm talking about?
About self-compassion?
No, it was a video that you talked about 3 things that you need to be in a relationship in building a positive, co-creating a relationship. One was consent, and one was that
agency.
Agency, yeah.
Yes,
and that you have agency in how you want to experience your body, your pleasure, your self-expression. And I have agency in how I do it. I don't need to put my idea of how I want to experience myself on you.
Yeah. Absolutely. Let's empower each other to make our own decisions for ourselves instead of making them for somebody else.
Yeah. So important. So much possibility and change in that. I really appreciate so much your knowledge and your expertise. Wow, you have so much information, and I appreciate how articulately you've shared it with our audience and with me. And so I really am grateful for you spending the time here today, and we'll definitely be sharing your links so people can connect with you in other ways. So thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
What is reverence? It's a way of living in awe and amazement at these outrageous, complex, and beautiful bodies, at the mere fact that we are alive at all, and to treat ourselves, each other, and the earth as if it was all a treasure, because it is. Be assured that anytime you feel small or contracted, there's a lie involved. Because the truth of you is perfect nature, perfect wholeness, always more than enough. The stories that we learn from family and culture, from thousands of years of culture, have often made the feminine less than, denigrated, or demeaned. We leave these stories in the past. We don't pass them on to our daughters and granddaughters. Knowing our worth, we step forward into this new moment, knowing that all of the world is a blend of male and female, and each element asks for celebration. We shine out and make a world that works for all women everywhere, starting with ourselves. Thank you for joining us at Women's Wisdom by Rosebud Woman. For more information and past episodes, please visit us at www.rosewoman.com.